The Thanksgiving turkey was perfectly roasted. The potatoes were creamy, and the tension in the Palmer family dining room was thick enough to carve with the silver serving knife that Margaret Palmer had inherited from her mother. I sat quietly at the end of the enormous mahogany table, trying to focus on my meal rather than the conversation swirling around me. My husband Thomas squeezed my hand under the table, his silent apology for his parents' behavior. "So Thomas tells us Westside General is offering you a position." My father-in-law Richard boomed from the head of the table. "Smart move, finally joining a real hospital. When do you start?" I took a small sip of water before answering. "I haven't accepted the offer, Richard. I'm happy at the East End Clinic." The look of disbelief on his face would have been comical if it weren't so insulting. "You can't be serious," Margaret interjected, her diamond bracelet clinking against her wine glass. "That place in that neighborhood." Thomas said the offer from Westside is triple your current salary. Thomas cleared his throat. "Mom, Sarah loves the work she's doing at East End. It's important to her. Playing nurse at some neighborhood clinic when she could be at Westside?" Richard scoffed. "No offense, Sarah, but a real doctor works at prestigious hospitals, builds connections, creates a legacy. I am building something meaningful," I said quietly. "East End serves people who can't pay," Margaret finished for me. "Such a waste of potential, especially with your education." "What was it? Harvard Medical?" "Johns Hopkins," I corrected, though I knew it made no difference to them. In their world, my choice to work at a community clinic rather than chase prestige and wealth was incomprehensible. Well, Richard raised his glass to Thomas's real achievement, making partner at Palmer Investments at just 32, youngest partner in the firm's history. I raised my glass along with everyone else, genuinely proud of my husband. Thomas had worked incredibly hard, even if his path had been smoothed by working at his father's investment firm. "At least one of you understands ambition," Richard added, unable to resist the dig. Later that night, as Thomas and I drove back to our modest apartment, another choice my in-laws couldn't understand given Thomas's income, he apologized. "I'm sorry about my parents. You know how they are." I did know. Richard and Margaret Palmer measured success in very specific ways. Prestigious institutions, income brackets, zip codes, and social connections. My choice to work at East End Clinic serving low-income patients was, to them, throwing away my medical degree. What they didn't know, what almost no one knew except Thomas and my closest colleagues, was that I wasn't just a doctor at East End Clinic. I was Dr. Sarah Chin Palmer, Chief of Cardiology at Boston Memorial Hospital, one of the top cardiac care centers in the country. I split my time between my hospital duties and a clinic, which BMH had established as a community outreach initiative under my direction. I had never corrected my in-laws' assumptions about my career. At first, it was because they showed so little interest in my work beyond where I did it. Later, it became a matter of principle. I refused to validate their shallow metrics of success. Thomas had urged me many times to set them straight. "They're being ridiculous, Sarah. If they knew you were literally one of the top cardiologists in the country, then what?" I'd ask. They'd suddenly respect the work I do at East End. They'd understand why I spend 3 days a week at a clinic in a neighborhood they'd never visit. No, they'd just focus on the BMH part and ignore the rest. So I had let the misunderstanding persist, limiting family conversations to Thomas's career and other safe topics. It wasn't ideal, but it kept the peace during the handful of times we saw them each year. What I couldn't have anticipated was how dramatically this arrangement would collapse just 3 weeks after that Thanksgiving dinner. The call came at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday. I was already at Boston Memorial, having been called in for an emergency valve replacement surgery 2 hours earlier. "Dr. Palmer," the ER resident's voice was tense. "We have a 64-year-old male with acute myocardial infarction being rushed in. EKG shows ST elevation in multiple leads. Ambulance ETA 4 minutes. Prep cath lab 2, I instructed, already moving toward the elevator. Have blood work ready and alert the surgical team as precaution." "Yes, doctor." There's one more thing. The patient's name is Richard Palmer. Any relation?" I froze mid-stride. "He's my father-in-law. I'm on my way down." The next moments passed in a blur as I called Thomas, who had been asleep at home, and then focused on preparing mentally for what was ahead. By the time the ambulance arrived, I was waiting in the ER. My professional demeanor firmly in place despite the personal connection. Richard was conscious but in obvious distress, his face gray with pain as the paramedics transferred him to the hospital gurney. Margaret followed behind, her normally perfect appearance disheveled, terror evident in her eyes. "Richard," she cried, rushing to his side. Then she saw me standing there in my white coat, stethoscope around my neck. Confusion crossed her face. "Sarah, what are you doing here?" Before I could answer, the charge nurse intervened. "Mrs. Palmer, Dr. Chen Palmer is our chief of cardiology. Your husband is in excellent hands." Margaret's mouth fell open, but there was no time to address her shock. "We need to move quickly," I said, my voice calm but authoritative. "Richard, you're having a heart attack. We're taking you to the catheterization lab immediately to clear the blockage." Richard stared at me with a mixture of pain and confusion. "You're the doctor? But you work at the clinic." "I'll explain everything later," I assured him as we began moving toward the cath lab. "Right now, I need you to trust me." To his credit, he nodded weakly. To Margaret, I added, "Thomas is on his way. The nurse will take you to the waiting area." The next 2 hours were among the most intense of my professional career. Richard's heart attack was severe, a complete blockage of the left anterior descending artery, often called the widowmaker. The procedure to clear it and place stents was complicated by his anatomy and the extent of the blockage. Throughout it all, I remained focused, pushing aside the personal connection and working with my team to save his life. Only afterward, when Richard was stabilized and moved to recovery, did I allow myself to feel the emotional weight of what had just happened. Thomas was waiting with Margaret in the family consultation room, both jumping to their feet when I entered. "He's stable," I said immediately, removing the surgical cap from my head. We were able to clear the blockage and place 2 stents. The next 24 hours are critical, but he responded well to the procedure. Margaret stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. You're really the chief of cardiology here?" I nodded, too exhausted for anything but directness. "Yes, for the past 3 years, I split my time between Boston Memorial and East End Clinic." "But why didn't you tell us?" she asked, her voice a mixture of confusion and what sounded almost like hurt. Thomas stepped in. "Mom, you and Dad never asked. You just assumed Sarah was playing nurse because she chose to work in a community clinic part of the week." Margaret had the grace to look embarrassed. "I don't understand. If you work here, why bother with that clinic at all?" I sank into a chair, suddenly aware I'd been on my feet for nearly 8 hours. "Because medicine isn't just about prestige or money, Margaret. East End Clinic serves people who would otherwise fall through the cracks of our healthcare system. We catch heart conditions before they become emergencies like Richard's. We manage chronic diseases that would otherwise go untreated. And yes, we do it regardless of the patient's ability to pay." "But you could be focusing entirely on your work here," she persisted, though with less certainty. "The clinic is my work here," I explained. Boston Memorial established it as an outreach initiative. I helped design the program. Preventative cardiology in underserved communities is my specialty. I've published research papers on it. The clinic isn't separate from my career, it's central to it." Margaret fell silent, processing this information that contradicted years of assumptions. Thomas put his arm around me, his support quiet but unwavering. Richard's recovery was lengthy but steady. During his 5 days in the hospital, he saw firsthand the respect my colleagues had for me. Attending physicians consulted me on other cardiac cases. Residents sought my guidance. Even the hospital administrator stopped by to check on Dr. Chen Palmer's father-in-law, making it clear that I was not just any staff cardiologist. On his 3rd day in the hospital, while Margaret was at their home gathering fresh clothes, Richard asked me a question that surprised me. "The clinic? East End. Do you really make a difference there?" I pulled up a chair beside his bed. "We do. Just last month, we identified 17 cases of undiagnosed hypertension, 3 previously undetected valve conditions, and 1 congenital defect in a teenager who had never had proper cardiac screening. Without the clinic, those conditions would have gone untreated until they became emergencies." "Like mine," he said quietly. "Actually, your heart attack might have been preventable with earlier intervention." I confirmed. "Your cholesterol levels and blood pressure readings from the past few years suggested increasing risk." He was silent for a moment. I always thought community medicine was less important. Second tier. Many people do, I said, checking his IV without commenting further. I was wrong, he added, his voice so quiet I almost missed it. 2 weeks after Richard's discharge, the Palmer family gathered again, this time at Thomas's and my apartment for a small dinner. Richard was still recovering, moving slowly and following a strict heart-healthy diet that Margaret had embraced with surprising enthusiasm. Before we eat, Richard said as we settled around our modest dining table, "I want to say something." He looked directly at me, his expression more open than I'd ever seen it. "Sarah, I owe you more than just my life, though that's no small debt. I owe you an apology. For years, I judged your career choices without understanding them. I dismissed work that quite literally saves lives every day because it didn't fit my narrow definition of success." Margaret nodded, adding, "We both did. We were so blinded by our own prejudices that we couldn't see the remarkable physician you are, not just at Boston Memorial but especially at East End." I felt Thomas squeeze my hand under the table, this time in celebration rather than consolation. "Thank you," I said simply. "That means a lot to me." "There's more," Richard continued. "Margaret and I have been discussing how we might support East End Clinic. I understand from Thomas that the facility needs expansion to serve more patients." I looked at my husband in surprise. He smiled sheepishly. Dad asked how he could help. I mentioned the expansion project you've been trying to fund. Richard nodded. "The Palmer Foundation would like to provide a grant to cover the full expansion costs. $2 million with an additional endowment for ongoing operational support." I was momentarily speechless. The expansion had been my dream for years. Additional exam rooms, a dedicated imaging center, and expanded hours to serve patients who couldn't take time off work. "Richard, Margaret, that's incredibly generous," I finally managed. "It's the least we can do," Margaret said. "Besides, I've been looking over the Foundation's giving strategy, and our focus on healthcare has been severely lacking. This is just good philanthropy." And Richard added with a wry smile, "The invoice for my hospital stay was quite educational. Seeing the true cost of emergency cardiac care versus preventative medicine was illuminating, to say the least." Later that evening, after Richard and Margaret had gone, Thomas pulled me into his arms. "So, Chief of Cardiology, how does it feel to finally be acknowledged by the intimidating Palmers?" I laughed. "Surreal. Though I'm still processing the fact that your father went from calling me a nurse to funding an entire clinic expansion in less than a month. Nothing like a near-death experience and a $287,000 hospital bill to change one's perspective." Thomas mused. "I never wanted them to find out this way," I said more seriously. "Despite everything, I wouldn't wish what Richard went through on anyone." Thomas nodded. "I know, but maybe something good will come from it beyond just his recovery. The expansion will help thousands of patients, Sarah." 6 months later, I stood beside Richard and Margaret at the groundbreaking ceremony for the newly named Chen Palmer Cardiovascular Center at East End Clinic. My patients, many of whom had taken time off from hourly jobs to attend, watched with pride as their doctor was celebrated not just by hospital administrators and local politicians, but by her formerly disapproving in-laws. "This center will bring world-class preventative cardiac care to our community," I told the gathered crowd. "No one should have to wait for an emergency to receive the medical attention they deserve." Afterward, as we toured the existing clinic, I introduced Richard and Margaret to our staff and several patients. One elderly woman took Margaret's hand and said with tears in her eyes, "Your daughter saved my life last year. I couldn't afford to see a heart doctor anywhere else." Margaret, who once would have been uncomfortable even visiting this neighborhood, embraced the woman warmly. "She saves a lot of lives," she said with genuine pride, including my husband's. That evening, as Thomas and I walked home from the ceremony, he asked, "Are you ever going to tell them that you turned down the chief position at Mayo Clinic last year?" I laughed. "Let's not push it. Some revelations are better saved for the future. Like the fact that you're being considered for the National Medal of Science." "Exactly. Small steps, Thomas. They're still adjusting to the idea that their daughter-in-law, who they thought was playing nurse, is actually changing how cardiac care is delivered in underserved communities." He put his arm around me as we walked. "You know what I love most about this whole situation? You never once did any of it. You researched the clinic, saving my father, to prove anyone wrong. You did it because it was right. Though I have to admit, I conceded with a smile, the look on your father's face when he saw me in my chief of cardiology coat was pretty satisfying. Almost as satisfying as watching him write that $2 million check. Thomas teased. No, I said more seriously. The most satisfying part is knowing that the expansion will help us reach thousands more patients. That's worth more than any title or recognition. As we reached our apartment building, I glanced back in the direction of the clinic. Tomorrow I will be back there, seeing patients who might otherwise go without care, continuing the work that had always been my true calling, regardless of who understood its value. Sometimes the most powerful validation doesn't come from proving others wrong, but from staying true to your path until they finally see its worth for themselves. In medicine as in life, the most meaningful rewards rarely come with prestigious titles or society's approval. They come from knowing that your work matters one heart at a time.